So, my former colleague, Pierpaolo Cazzola, just told me you need to be stricter with people. Tell them to sit down. So I'm still kindly asking you to now take your seats. Together with my colleague, Ingrid El Helou, Dr. Ingrid El Helou. Good morning.
Hello. Hello.
Good morning. Who is a clean tech analyst with a specialization on aviation, sustainable aviation, has a technical background. She's an engineer, chemical engineer. We welcome you to the second day of the ARC Clean Tech Innovation Festival. And we have something to catch up on from yesterday, which is the welcome message from one of our partners, UN Climate Change in Bonn. It's from the UN campus. As you know, the negotiations are ongoing. And so we'll hear real brief from Carlos Ruiz-Gavia from UN Climate Change. As he's negotiating today, we have pre-recorded the message, and we hope it works today.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you very much to the organizers for this kind invitation to contribute to this important event. First of all, I would like to also thank to the Mayor of Ramstein for hosting such an important event, including, of course, these sessions at the ARC Festival. And this is thanks to the collaboration with Future Clean Architects, but also a big range of partners, including collaborators such as UNIDO, our colleagues at the Tech and CTCM, but also a different branch of partners that work closely with the Global Innovation Hub. So I'd like to thank you for these tireless efforts as we move towards making every year the ART Festival a success. On behalf of our Executive Secretary, Simon Steele, I'd like to highlight his messaging at COP27 in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh last November, indicating that Paris gave us the agreement, Katowice and Glasgow gave us the plan, and Sharm el-Sheikh shifted us towards implementation. No one can be mere passenger on this journey. And this is a clear signal that times have changed and that our policies, business, infrastructure, and actions, whether personal or public, must be aligned with the Paris Agreement and with the Convention. This IPCC community of scientists also told us that it's important and mandatory to cut emissions by nearly half by 2030, which is only 7 years away, which has given us the reassurance that there is no room for backsliding, and that the phase down of all fossil fuels is happening. That's why the ART Festival, looking to means to decarbonize hard-to-abate industries, is so important. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak virtually with you today, and I look forward, of course, to the outcomes of this busy week that you will have at the ART Festival, and I wish you much success, and we in the Global Innovation Hub are at your disposal. Thank you so much.
So, just an update, the date has been set. The results from this conference will be presented at the SB sessions at the negotiations in Bonn on next Wednesday. That is June 14th. We'll summarize them in 1 hour, which includes a quarter of an hour for aviation. So anything you'll say today might pop up there. But I think we should start with a question on why is aviation so relevant? And we have some slides for you, and we have an expert who couldn't know better. Ingrid, the share is pretty high of emissions, correct?
Yes. If we just look at CO2 emissions, it's about 2% of global CO2 emissions, CO2 equivalent. And this is pre-pandemic levels. It was about a bit over 1 gigaton, and we know now the industry is recovering once again. But the most important thing with aviation is that looking at CO2 emissions is not enough.
We have this iceberg metaphor here. How does it work?
The most talked about emissions when it comes to aviation are CO2 emissions, but they're about a third of the total global warming impact of aviation on the planet. If we look at the hidden effects, they're almost 2/3 of aviation's total impact on the planet, and they're what we refer to as non-CO2 effects.
Right, and there's other challenges in aviation. We can see it here one more time. Maybe say a word on contrails are completely neglected, I think, and also the other kind of emissions. We have a pilot, or maybe even several pilots in the room. We can discuss this later, at which cruising altitudes one flies and what kind of effect that has. But maybe Ingrid shed some light on this overview.
Absolutely. Contrails make up a bit over 50% of aviation's impact on the planet. And they are a result of what comes out of the exhaust of the plane, but also when certain environmental, atmospheric conditions are met. And then that it's not only about contrails, you also have NOx, you have water vapor, you have soot particles. All of these together make up almost two-thirds of aviation's impact on the planet.
Thank you. And we have another chart, which we would like to share with you,
Yes.
which is the incredible share of passenger travel. One always thinks cargo, so many goods are transported, but as share of the emissions, the cargo part is not so big.
Correct. If we want to think of passenger emissions, they're about 4 times larger than freight, and they're not equally distributed based on the range of the flight. So long haul, actually, as part of passenger emissions, long haul is the largest contributor to emissions. If we then look at percentage of flights that fall into the different ranges, it's actually quite disproportionate. You have 5% of all flights are long haul, but they contribute around a third to the overall emissions of the sector, which is quite staggering.
So, quite a lot of challenges. And what we will see later, I don't know, do we have another slide? I can't remember. Was that the last one? Yes, I was hoping for this. Now, this is all draft. I see people, as always, or usually when we present these things, also at COP or wherever, people start taking pictures. I always note, okay, this must be interesting. So this is not released yet. See, this will all come out, you will all get it. We're working on a new fact sheet. You know, we had the last one on LDES, long duration energy storage. By the way, I must not forget, otherwise Leonie from our team will be very mad with me. The LDES design thinking workshop starting immediately after this session at 2:10. So those few who are in the design thinking workshop with Lufthansa, by the way, for LDES, please go there. But let's go back to this. So there's a new fact sheet in planning on aviation and a new movie. And we would like to show you real quick, and then the experts will take over in depth, how limited, there's a lot of opportunities to decarbonize and defossilize, turn aviation climate neutral, but the respective scopes are quite narrow. Let's start with electric.
Absolutely. So this is not an exhaustive list. We can't put everything out there on one chart, but these are some examples of planned projects and what we can expect to see in the coming 10, 20 years, potentially. So if we want to think of electric, it's quite limited in range. We look at projects that are small in size, less than even 50 seats, and limited in range to 200 kilometers. You want to go to 400 kilometers or more, you have to drop the number of seats. If you want to increase the range of electric right now, you have to switch to hybrid. This is the first, some examples of aircraft. Then you can think of hydrogen combustion, hydrogen fuel cells as a hybrid combustion fuel cell or on its own. Then you can increase the range, increase the seating maybe less than 100 seats if you're looking at a turboprop. You want to increase the range a bit more, then you have to switch to a turbojet, still hydrogen combustion or a fuel cell, and again, limited in range still. And finally, what we've been hearing about a lot, of course, is SAFs, and there you won't have any limitations in terms of range or in terms of seating.
And we've gone a long way in preparing a chapter for you, so the aviation chapter, that tackles what we believe some of the most important challenges. Maybe we can, I know there's one more slide, but maybe we can take a look at the chapter briefly. Would that be possible? Simon, our poor stage managers, you always have to jump between documents and get extra chairs in and this kind of stuff, these kind of things. So real quick, I start, you complement if you like. So after this, we call it a high-level panel of where are we in aviation right now. with exciting experts and a great moderator. Then there's a break, 15-minute break, and then we have parallel sessions. There's the toolbox for policymakers again, on the what we call stage, so the big theater stage, everybody sitting on the stage, on the policy tools that are available to lawmakers to decarbonize aviation and get it climate neutral. At the same time, we have a session with our partners from Clean Air Task Force, who again kindly volunteered to have something on the climate impacts of aviation with a special focus on, Ingrid? It's not on the program. On contrails. So the big part of the climate effect you've seen. And then there's two parallel sessions, one on addressing specifically hydrogen and SAFs, so the options of hydrogens and sustainable aviation fuels. And in the other, we'll take a look 10, 20 and more years to the future. It's on breakthrough innovations and alternatives to flying. High-speed trains, night trains, and very, very new types of designs. What have I forgotten?
Just last comment that approximately half the emissions from aviation are due to international travel, which is an additional complexity that we need to think about, and is also something that we're going to be addressing in these sessions today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This is leading us to our first panel, and we have won not only an excellent range of experts, international experts, whom our moderator will introduce, but we've also won a great moderator. And you know, there's a bias in, especially in Germany, towards commercial TV, commercial radio, you know, the bigger papers and so. Sometimes they know you can only be do excellent journalist work if you're in a niche, little specialized paper or so that's only working on climate issues or only working on aviation. There's an expert we've met a couple of times now. There's a journalist expert a couple of times now. She's from the largest, I believe, German television group, RTL NTV. Her name's Clara Pfeffer. She's with us today. May we ask you on stage? May we ask all the panelists on stage? And they are doing great work on effective climate reporting. Please come here, Clara. It's a pleasure having you.
Thanks.
The mic is yours. So are the others. And I hope you enjoy the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. What an introduction. Or do you want me there? Yeah, perfect. No problem. Okay, should we just keep it that way? Then I'll go on the very here. Do you want the microphone? Probably, yes. Yes, thank you very much for that introduction, Peter. That was quite humbling, I hope. And welcome to our first panel this morning. I'm very excited to be moderating this one because I think we all agree, and at least for me, it's a very personal question when it comes to aviation. We are quite aware of the fact that it has huge impacts on the planet, but most of us, I did a very quick non-scientific survey yesterday night, most of us do not want to stop flying, and we might have personal reasons, business reasons, there's many reasons, and we could also say that it's actually a good thing if you want to connect people around the world and have intercultural exchange. I think it is important to keep that alive. Makes it even more important to really reduce the carbon footprint. We already heard how long-haul flights are the big share. And if we look at the CO2 emissions in comparison of how many people are actually responsible for that, that makes it quite a big issue because all of the policy measures that we talk about, we need to communicate those to the public. That's what I am an expert at, hopefully. And you already spoke a little bit about RTL, the network I work for. We reach an audience. Many of them do not have the chance to fly long haul or fly at all. And if you look at the share, we have about 10% of the world's population who has ever been on a plane, and those people emit about 2.8%. That amount's going to grow largely over the next couple of years. So there's a big social justice issue in that discussion, which I hope that we can have in the back of our minds when we talk about this. And now I'm going to introduce this amazing panel that I'm very honored to lead today. We have Dr. Maximilian Held from the Possible Partnership. Very excited to have you here. Mario Vasco, who's a venture manager. which I also think is an important part in this. We want to get the money in the right places. We have Pier Paolo Cazzolo. I hope I said that right. I was so focused on that I got yours wrong. I'm sorry. Research fellow at Columbia University. Excited to have you here. And Ingrid needs no introduction anymore. Thank you so much. Yeah, let's get this started. We know that the aviation industry wants to get get their zero net by 2050. That's not that far away, and it's even a goal that we could discuss about if it's enough. We've just had the message from the UN Commission in Bonn, and actually 2050 is probably not fast enough to really reach our global climate goals. But let's focus on 2050. Lots of talk about that. Ingrid, I'll start with you because you're already in the in the game. When we look from now, how do you think is the industry really going to change in the next 25 years? You already did a little bit of introduction of what's realistic.
Hello? It's fine. Hi, everyone. Hello again. Thank you. That's definitely a great question, very important in terms of aviation. And I think it's really important for us to think about how far away 2050 is, realistically, for the industry. And we cannot think of 2050 without thinking about what's happening in the industry today. And overwhelmingly, we're still flying on conventional jet fuel. We have more than 99% of our fuel that's conventional kerosene. And right now, also the uptake of aircraft in the industry that we're selling today are still the conventional design, the wing swept design that we see everywhere, that we board when we fly a plane. So that's very important, especially because the lifespan of a plane is very long. So we're thinking 25 plus years. So what we sell today, we will see in 2050. And if we think about changes in the industry is very conservative. And rightly so, in the sense that we have to think about safety a lot. So to introduce new technology, it takes a long time. And that has already sped up in the industry already, thanks to lots of improvements in experiments, also in modeling, which has helped speed up things. But if we look at conventional aircraft like the Airbus A380, which is the jumbo double-decker that we all know, the largest aircraft, from design and concept to implementation and taking flight, that took 20 years. So if we want to think of changing the technology or switching to electric or hydrogen, that's something to keep in mind.
And those are the planes being sold right now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll pass that one on to Pier Paolo. I think that's a very crucial point. If you think about the fact, how far are we? Are we able to sell planes that fly on different fuels today?
Okay, one of the key aspects of aviation is that the fuel specs are quite strict. You cannot do so much. There are not so many molecules that fit the purpose of being liquid at ground level and also at high altitude. They have high energy density and all that. So then the end result is that even in a transition, aside from the case of hydrogen that Ingrid talked about, you will have to basically figure out a way to make a low carbon fuel that has the same properties. So that's this concept of sustainable aviation fuel is essentially that. So technically, aircraft can fly on something that has a lower carbon fuel as long as the fuel has the same properties. The challenge is how you make sure that you can produce the fuel in a way that is low carbon. So that's where the complication starts, is where the chemical engineers have fun, basically. And so I think in that respect, the issue is not on like aircraft not being able to burn this fuel, but rather how we make sure we have this fuel affordable and produce low carbon. In addition to that, there is maybe another aspect which is important, I think also linked with the hydrogen aircraft, is that no matter what, we will be interested in increasing energy efficiency of aircraft. This is something that normally has been taking place with a certain pace. I think now we are facing a bigger challenge if you really want to achieve the decarbonization, so we will need to accelerate that pace. This has to do with the kind of aircraft designs that will come in, and arrangements in terms of like integrating potentially batteries and electrification or hydrogen, hybridization, all that sort of stuff that then can also, while you change the fuel, you also make aircraft more efficient. And so that's another area of big development, I think.
So we have a lot of developments going on at the same time. We need to speed up. I think that's a sentence that we hear whenever we talk about climate issues. Mario, when you're as a venture manager in the industry, are people actually already doing that? Are they spending their money on these kinds of developments?
Yes, absolutely. It's like Ingrid already mentioned, it takes really long time. I can give you a little example. When I was doing my PhD on materials, actually, is a material called glare that ended up on the A380, this big giant plane that we mentioned. Well, from inception to actually put it on an airplane took 20 years, 25 years. Now, all of this is because, yeah, we need safety, and we need to test and investigate and certify, but all of this takes too much time. So we need to speed up all this procedure. We need to simplify this procedure. Also because all the certification period can be really a killer for a small, medium enterprise, especially for startups that just can't afford. And we have tools that allow us to save time and money, which are the digital tools. So I'm really a fan of digital technologies like digital twins, computational modeling, and so forth, that allow us to test proof of concept, prototypes, ideas in the computer, in the virtual world before we start to actually build a physical prototype. And it's important that safety agencies, aviation safety agencies, start to take this on board and allow the industry to use these tools to simplify and shorten the period that requires today to certify a new idea, a new material, a new engine, a new aircraft.
It's a very interesting part. I think we'll talk more about policy measures when we go further with this panel. I want to come back to the actual possibilities that we have. And I think what you kind of touched there in a sentence is that we need a lot of data to understand what we can do. Maybe, Maximilian, you can give us a short overview of how good is the data? Do we actually, because I've read a lot about this right now, and to me, it seems like there's a lot of things that we already know that we could change today, but there's also a lot of parts that we don't know and where a lot of data is missing and where the communication between researchers and the industry is still improvable.
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say we have enough data to act and to accelerate. There is, of course, this clear separation between CO2 and non-CO2 effects. So if we're talking about aviation-induced cloudiness, so contrails, persistent contrails, cirrus clouds, like the 67% that we saw earlier, there we need more certainty in the data because the uncertainty ranges are just huge. But I would say on the CO2 side of things, we are quite clear what we need to do. We already heard like efficiency improvements, sustainable aviation fuels, novel propulsion technologies. And just to put it into perspective, if we look at the cumulative CO2 reduction that we can gain from these three measures, efficiency improvements will probably contribute 40% of what we need to achieve by 2050. SAF's 50% and the last 10% from novel propulsion aircraft. This is, of course, like just giving you a house number. But I think it's enough to actually act on it. And you've asked whether we already see progress on those areas. You mentioned the more innovation side on the data, software, maybe novel propulsion aircraft side, but we see that also for sustainable aviation fuels. So I've tracked basically within my work at MPP how many SAF plants have been announced over time. So, and announcements are far away from final investment decision, for sure. But if we just track the announced plans, we see 2 years ago, we had like 20, 25 plants being announced. 1 year ago, that doubled to 50. And right now we are at over 100. So in the last 2 years alone, it has gone this exponential rate, or it has started. And I think we are now at a make or break point where we need to bring the first of those to final investment decision to actually show that it's feasible and that there is a business case in order to accelerate.
As journalists, we do love announcements because that's something that we can track down later on. So that's actually a very exciting point. So I would say demand is there, demand is going to grow. How far are we on the supply side? I mean, I always hear people from the industry saying, yeah, it's great that we have all these plans, but we have no idea if we can actually supply the industry with all of these SAFs. How far would you say are we with there? How's the production side of the SAFs going on?
So I think first off, we need to think, what does SAF mean? So sustainable aviation fuel, that's actually an umbrella term. So are we looking at biological sources, or are we looking at non-biological sources? So far, the amount of sustainable aviation fuels that have been used has been increasing exponentially in aviation. But in 2022, that number was about 300 million liters. That's about less than 0.1% of jet fuel consumption, but it is exponentially rising. And most of that has been biofuels. And that has to do with how you certify a fuel as compatible for jet fuels. Then we need to look at how do we decide if something is sustainable enough. And then we need to talk about e-fuels, power-to-liquid fuels, and that is taking your hydrogen, you use water, you use an electrolyzer, you convert it to hydrogen, then you use CO2. Again, the question is, where does that CO2 come from? Are you taking it from capturing it and using it from another industry? That has questions in itself. Are you directly capturing the CO2 from the air? That has a question in itself. Where's the electricity coming from to produce your hydrogen? So these are all like supply constraints that we need to deal with moving forward. But with new regulations coming in, we will see the scale up. What Max also mentioned, there are plans for e-fuels. We need to think also, we need to increase the focus on e-fuels, both biofuels and e-fuels. Also, there is a large supply of biofuels. Should we divert some from road transport maybe towards aviation? Big question.
Yeah, very big question in Germany, I would say, when we talk about e-fuels and biofuels. Let's unbundle that a little bit, Pierpaolo. We have biofuels, and whenever we speak about biofuels, we have the issue that those products could also be used as nutrition. So there's always a big competition when we talk about biofuels. So if I understood you correctly, we want to move towards e-fuels, towards SAFs that actually capture carbon and then burn it again. So where would you say, how do we make sure that the industry focuses on that instead of the biofuels? Because if we really want to speak about the effects on the planet, we don't want everyone go into biofuels because that seems to be the easier choice at the moment.
Okay, this is a complex space, but I would say if there is a place where there may be quite a bit of sense for the good version of the biofuels, this is probably the aviation. Another one is maritime, definitely more than road. Having said this, I think we do understand that there are good points in the fact that we are basically competing for land with other uses, with whether it is like something that can help absorbing some of the CO2 from the atmosphere, forests, or whether that's needed for food. There is land, there is a competition for land and water and other resources. So then that's where there are the limiting factors coming for the biofuels, and where I think there is a genuine need to look into other options, the synthetic fuels, so-called RFNBOs, renewable fuels of non-biological origin in Europe. The way you do that, I think we have what is in place now in terms of like almost finalized legislation in the EU after the Fit for 55 is a good example. Globally, I think is one of the most advanced policy frameworks. And it's essentially combining requirements, mandates, with carbon pricing, and the use of the carbon revenues, the carbon pricing revenues, to actually foster innovation. So it's a combination of these three things, which I think is a good cocktail to ensure that you can provide price signals, give certainty to people that want to invest in supplying the fuels, and also helping bringing down the cost using the revenues that you're raising like that. So without like adding a huge burden across the board in terms of carbon price, but yeah, really raising significant amount of money in a way that is economically sustainable to actually reinvest it in the sector. So I think we're doing the right stuff in Europe, and it's going to be challenging to make sure that everyone else gets on board with that type of framework, because this is unique globally at this stage. Maybe California has something that goes in that direction, but aviation is not fully included.
It's always good to have some positive news on the EU frameworks. And you gave me an important keyword, and that's pricing and money, which also leads me to Mario again. How expensive is this going to be? What does this mean to the industry? Can we actually afford that as a private consumer as well?
That's a great question. First of all, I would like to say that I could subscribe word by word what Pierpaolo just said in terms of general framing of the question. At the moment, we know that SAF is like 3 to 6 times more expensive than fossil fuel, depending on the feedstock that we're using and depending on the process that we're using. And this especially applies to syn fuels. So one thing that has already emerged is that biological SAF, so SAF, which is based on biological feedstock, gives us is the most promising in the short and medium term, especially all the processes based on HEFA, H-E-F-A, so using acid fats. But it will always be limited in terms of supply, feedstock supply. So we'll never go over a certain threshold. We'll never be able to cover all the needs of the aviation market. Plus, it gives us all these stories, all these political, humanitarian problems. So the real answer in the medium-long term is a syn fuel. However, syn fuel is very expensive, and we can expect it to remain expensive for quite some time. So in order to make it become more palatable for the industry and for the traveler, for the consumer, well, the prices have to go down, and of course, we need taxation on carbon so that the price of carbon fuel, which at the moment is sort of artificially low because it doesn't take into consideration all the externalities, all the side effects, the side damages, has to increase. And this will have consequences on the industry, on the habits of the consumers. Yes, of course it will. But ultimately, this is something that we can't escape.
I think that's very interesting because that price issue is very important for the policy measures that I want to move on to now. Because if we think about, I've just said, if I think about my audience that does represent a big part of the German population, most of them are happy to afford at least one flight a year wherever they're going for their holidays, and we want to give people the choice, I think, to do that. We agree on that. How are we going to include that in the framework? I mean, you've mentioned a few ideas. Maybe Maximilian, you have a few other ideas how we can actually make sure that within that transition, where we'll have to tax carbon emissions with a very high CO2 price, and at the same time moving on to a new technology that will be very expensive for the start.
Yeah, it's really a tricky question to answer. First of all, I think we need to be honest in the communications. We need to be honest and transparent that SAFs currently simply cost 3 to 6x of fossil jet fuel. And the jet fuel itself is like roughly 25% of the ticket price. So you currently, if you want to fly on SAFs, and it's possible, you can do that, you very quickly double the ticket price. Now, that might be possible for some of us, but if we're really looking at the just transition globally, many people can, as you said, like afford a flight maybe a year or no flight at all in their whole lifetime so far. So this challenge of bringing the green premium down to actually ensure that in the long run we can fly sustainably at a reasonable cost is super important, but it's challenging. And therefore, I think what Pierpaolo said at the beginning, that we also need to focus on efficiency improvements, is really key. Because if you imagine an aircraft becoming twice as efficient until 2050, we can discuss whether that's feasible, but just imagine it for now. And SAFs will become cheaper over time and maybe only cost double the price of fossil jet fuel by 2050. Then we have a cost-neutral transition because we only need half the amount of fuel. And I think that needs to be the long-term goal. How we manage that in the short term is definitely, as you already said, through policies that support this initial cost reduction, but also basically spreading the green premium over those customer segments that can actually afford this. And we've seen this, for example, in the First Movers Coalition, where corporate buyers are already willing to invest into sustainable aviation fuel use because they can reduce their Scope 3 emissions. So a lot of big corporates, frequent flyers, are already doing that in order to get this cost curve down. And I think that's an important role as well.
Yeah, those are some very good answers to that one, and I think that point of efficiency is important to talk about. Ingrid, would that be the low-hanging fruit that you say doesn't get enough attention at the moment? That's something that we could improve at a more cost-efficient scale?
Definitely. I think, like it was already mentioned by Pierpaolo and Mario and Max, that efficiency gains are very important moving forward, especially because historically, when we get these gains, we see alternatively a drop in ticket price. And so demand shoots up, and then whatever gains you get from efficiency are overcome by the demand increase. We're not going to see that moving forward, and I think actually the increase in prices for the fuels moving forward, which is something we can't escape, again, repeating what everyone said, is going to drive this efficiency, whether it's improved fuel burn in the engine, composite materials, there's lots that can be done. And you can see that when you, in the engines that are working today, they're about 20 to 25% more efficient than their first gen equivalent. So that is just going to increase moving forward. And I think when we talk about, last point, when we talk about price increase for the consumer, we should also think about the carbon intensity of the passenger kilometer. And that is not equal when you're economy class versus business class versus first class versus private jet. And that's also something to keep in mind moving forward.
Yeah, interesting point. The private jets are a huge political discussion at the moment right now because of climate activists focusing on that. But I want to go a bit more in depth with the efficiency measures that you've mentioned. You talked about some engines that we can improve. Maybe you can just go a bit more in depth in the possibilities that we have there?
Absolutely. So in terms of fuel efficiency measures moving forward, you can reduce the weight. Usually, most of the efficiency gains we've gained up till now has had to do more with packing the load factor of the aircraft. So moving forward, we have to really improve the technology, work on our engines, and we've already seen that with the engines coming out in like by Rolls-Royce and GE. They're really focusing on these efficiency gains. Lots of composite materials that we're seeing coming out in terms of like the turbine design, in terms of the compressor design. I can talk about this for a very long time.
No, I'll stop you if it gets boring, don't worry. No, but it's just interesting to get a picture in our heads what's actually going to be done. Maybe something that the German engine industry could focus on as well. Sounds very interesting. And these measures are mostly about CO2, but we've seen the iceberg theory. So maybe move on to Pierpaolo as well. I think it was Peter who mentioned it, that if we change flight routes and the heights at which we fly, we could already change a lot at the moment. Why is that not happening right now to reduce the contrails, the other part of the effects that flying has on the planet?
So I think that the topic is very intriguing. So we begin to be more aware of the non-CO2 impacts. This is something that didn't come through very clearly up to a few years ago. I think by now we know there is an uncertainty, but we also know that this is really a big thing. And I've seen also important changes in the way the aviation industry itself talks about non-CO2 effects. So the impression, I'm not a specialist on that, but the impression I get is that we could achieve quite a lot in terms of reducing non-CO2 impacts with some degree of additional cost in terms of fuel burn, which is one of the barriers. You don't want to consume more because that's what the cost you actually face. So then the question is, how do we set up a policy framework that helps accepting that increase in fuel burn in order to have like big gains in terms of non-CO2 impact reduction? And I think the aviation industry is really starting to look into that and figuring out which kind of technologies could help us with that. I think we're still behind on the policy framework that would enable it. I think there are challenges also. If you achieve sizable gains in terms of CO2 emission reduction or non-CO2 climate forcing impact, does this mean that you want to reduce the pressure on figuring out what to do with the CO2 impacts? My personal opinion is no, you should do the two separately.
Both at the same time should be possible.
But voilà, there's quite a bit. So I think this is a new area where we will see a lot of developments. No, not new area. It's an area of renewed interest, let's say, or a growing interest where we'll see a lot of developments, where there are opportunities, but there are also risks, like of basically trying to slow down the rest of the change, which is, I think, in a way necessary. I'll stop there.
But you said at the start that the EU is actually quite far ahead with all the regulations and the policy frameworks that we already have in place. But on this issue, you would say they're behind. Just making sure that I understood that right.
Okay, on this issue, the EU is working towards being able to measure things better and have a better understanding of like key parameters that need to be regulated or potentially need to be regulated afterwards. Key technologies that can actually work for achieving these. So you need some degree of precision in a way if you want to do policy making. So, and we're not yet there. So I think the EU is working on.
I wasn't sure. Are you all hearing as well?
Yeah, the EU is working on setting up a framework that enables then policy action to be taken later, I think. We do not yet have those tools. So whether the EU is behind the rest of the world, I wouldn't say that, because I'm not aware of many others globally that are actually working on setting up that framework of data and information acquisition, which is anyway a prerequisite for policy action.
Mario, from your point of view, how interested are airlines already in changing their flight routes? Because there's no pricing on non-CO2 emissions right now. So is there really an incentive for airlines to, or for the industry in total, to actually really look into that and to change their routes, to change the way they fly? Do you see that happening?
I see that happening as much as the public is going to put pressure on it. As much as this becomes a return in terms of image, in terms of marketing, and if there is pressure from the political world, from the policy. So without these two elements, I don't see them really getting motivated. But sometimes my perception is actually a bit negative. It feels like, the orchestra on Titanic playing the music while Titanic is sinking. Yeah, it feels a bit like that. Like the music is playing while the entire industry is facing the brink of a potential big blow. Because we understand that if at the moment the emissions due to aviation is 2%, like Ingrid said, some other data say 4%, but increases to 40%, because all the other sectors are decarbonizing: shipping, cars, trucks, production of electricity. Well, when at a certain point only a small percentage of the world population is responsible for 40% of all emissions, I think we're going to face an uproar. We're going to have a lot of people very, very discontent. And this is going to hit the industry very, very badly. So I think and hope that the leaders of this industry are going to become more and more aware of these dangers ahead, and this is going to press the industry to tackle these issues with more energy. Let's not forget that the airlines are the major customers of OEMs, so what the airlines want then falls down to the OEM. And another point is that some of the biggest industries, it's a cascade. The airlines are customer to the OEMs, but there are other industries like business travels and events, or holidays and so forth, which are more in direct contact with the end user, who can have a huge lobbying power. So we also need to look at those sectors which are more face-to-face with the customer, to get aware and make feel the pressure on the airlines, and the airlines feel the pressure on the OEMs. Yeah?
So we need a lot of pressure from a lot of sides.
Yes,
I think
do.
I understood that. And that image that you just pictured of the orchestra playing on the Titanic, I think yesterday it was that the International Air Transport Association had their big meeting, and they talked about record passenger numbers and record profits. So they're actually, it's understandable that they're enjoying the party as long as it lasts. And I think we've all been there. And we need to increase the pressure. Maybe Maximilian, we've talked about a few policy measures. What other instruments are there to incentivize really the industry to speed up the change and to really go and look into that? What do you think?
I think one overlooked potential and also a necessity is that corporates like airlines cannot solve the problem alone. We need to focus way more on the entire ecosystem, and policy is one part of it. The fuel production side is one part of it. The upstream energy suppliers is part of it, and that is sustainable biomass, renewable electricity, green hydrogen, CO2, etc. The off-takers, in the end, like the corporate buyers, have a role to play. The financial institutions to actually finance all of this. Insurers, how can we actually insure the risk of some SAF plants maybe in the future not being able to produce at a certain price point? So like, it's so fragmented that we need this cross-value chain collaboration that we currently see popping up more and more, but there is so much more potential. And I think if we look at individual projects, most of the successful projects have such an angle. They have all those pieces in place. If we look at a SAF plant again, I'm focusing very much on sustainable aviation fuels in my daily work. So we need to, if you're a SAF producer and you're planning to build a plant, you need to have a long-term offtake agreement at a fixed price that de-risks your investment. You need to have the capital providers. You need to have the right supply. If you're, for example, talking about sustainable biomass, you need to look at a radius of like 100 kilometers around the plant where you want to build it to source the feedstock. Because this is the range that you're looking at for many biomass feedstocks. So this is really an issue and super complex. Then planning and permitting, what incentive stack can you get from policymakers? Like, it's so complex, you need to put everything into place to make those projects bankable and to create positive MPV cases in the end. I think that is what we'll see in the future more and more, that the whole value chain will collaborate more.
And would you agree with Mario that at the moment that's not really happening, that we have a lot of people just playing on with the orchestra?
I would agree with that. In a sense, if we zoom out a little bit, we already heard that right now we are really at the beginning of this transition. We are currently producing 0.1 megatons of SAF, and we globally use over 300 megatons of jet fuel a year. So it's nothing. So we have this challenge of creating an industry basically from scratch, not entirely, but more or less, within 25 years. Have we done that ever before in any other sectors? I don't think so, and I'm happy to take any guesses also where that has been demonstrated. So it's a huge challenge, and that's why there is a lot of risk involved, a lot of uncertainty involved. Wherefore, we don't see a lot of, haven't seen a lot of movement up until 2021, I would say. But since then, it has accelerated massively, and I think it's also a great opportunity for new innovations, new startups coming into the field and shaking this whole industry up and really making this transition possible.
And I guess that's also why these events are so important. That's what I wanted to say. We need to get people together and really talk about that. I want to make sure that you all have time to ask questions. So if you already have questions, please raise your hand anytime. Okay, there's one already. And I'll make sure for you to have 3 points that you wish for, that we want to look forward to.
Yeah, Hanno Böck, I'm a journalist. There's a report from the Clean Sky Research Project where they run the numbers for hydrogen and e-fuels-based aviation. And what they come out with is that you would end up with between 20 and 30 petawatt hours of electricity. And that's like around the world electricity production today in total. So you would need to double the electricity production just for aviation fuels. And I'm wondering if that's in any way plausible, and if these numbers wouldn't tell you that this just is practically impossible to build all these e-fuels factories and wind turbines, etc. And if that doesn't mean we need to also talk about demand.
Probably. I think we touched that a little bit, that demand is a huge point. Mario, if you want to.
Yeah. That's a very good point. I think that actually it's going to be more than just double. If we look to have enough hydrogen or synthetic fuel by 2050 in order to be net zero, according to certain assessment, it could be even 80 times the present production of green electricity only to serve the vision. Yeah, no, but I think it could be much more than just double. Only to serve aviation. And so imagine that how much more electricity we'll need also for the consumer users, the other industrial sectors, and so forth. So yeah, I had 3 points, my 3 desires. I would like to express one now, if I can.
Please go ahead.
And it's something that I never see sitting in this kind of venues anybody from the power industry.
They're very busy at the moment.
But do they realize that the aviation industry is going to come at their door knocking for a huge amount of green power, green electricity coming from wind turbines, coming from solar panel and so forth. What we are not seeing also is, should the aviation industry take electricity from nuclear power, for instance?
Another very big topic, if you take it to Germany. I know it's discussed very differently across European countries. Maybe not get into that, that would be another full hour at least. But I think it's very interesting to hear that the demand part, I think, is something that we really need to keep in the back of our minds. It's supposed to grow in a crazy scale, and I've already said it's a very personal matter as well. If you think about yourself, if you think about your children or whoever, you're thinking like, I want people to explore the world. So that's why this issue is so difficult to touch. And I really liked your one wish, maybe get the electricity sector on board. Maybe we'll find a comparison. It would be a good chart to see how many wind turbines we would need in all of our gardens and solar plants, probably much more than Germany can offer. If there are any more questions, please let me know. Start here with
Thank you. First, a comment. I work for more power and heat, so I'm not an aviation specialist with Agora Energiewende. But I'm glad it came out so clearly today in the discussion, because I really think we are fooling ourselves with aviation. And to pick up on where Mario just said, power sector not aware, what I see in the EU level discussion, indeed, I think just the massive amounts that would need to go into aviation and maritime, we have not fully understood that we need to divert biofuels into those sectors. I would say, from what I understood from experts, they mostly say since maritime has no feasibility to capture green premium, that they would get the biofuel first. So all of this redirection is completely missing. I think that that's something to be set up also for the new Commission's program. But what I've seen, I agree with what Mario said, is at the moment what we see is a hijacking of these very costly fuels for incumbents, for low temperature heat where there are alternatives. So we need to correct this. So hydrogen, everyone wants hydrogen, you know, even if they need to boil 100 degrees. So that's at the moment. So no, that is true, and that's not understood, I think. I think that's something to be set up for whatever Green Deal too, definitely. And then I wanted to ask, so I work a lot on gas, on the gas sector, and heard about this contrail and non-CO2 emissions, and I'm wondering to what effect it would also be time to change, to convert everything internationally and EU level into CO2 equivalent, because it seems to hide a lot of things. That's, for example, also why gas has such an easy ride, because we are not looking at the effects of methane, and it seems to be very similar in your sector. Would it be time to get rid of this accounting trick to translate everything into CO2 equivalent at this point, with a view to tipping points, etc.? Thanks, that was very long.
No, I think there were some good points for the wish list that we're going to have. It's going to be a long list, I guess. And Pierpaolo, you have some ideas on that question?
Okay, I just want to pick up on the last bit of the CO2 equivalent. So I want to try to bring in some positives here, because I think we are drifting into negatives. So first, aviation has already done quite a bit there. ICAO has taken an approach that looks at aviation fuels from a life cycle perspective. If you look this in a comparative way to what IMO has done, we're not even there with IMO in the shipping sector, even though we should be. So there is already in the aviation sector a strong awareness about the fact that if you look at SAF, you need to look at life cycle emissions, and that's precisely CO2 equivalent. Non-CO2 effect come on the top of that, and I think aviation is the only sector really affected by that. The methane comparison, if you take an LCA approach, would basically integrate methane leaks into whatever characterizes methane at the end, like for the end user. So we are already there in aviation. That's a positive thing. On the large amount of electricity required, well, I think the answer to that is yes, we will need electricity for FNBOs. Aviation is just about 10% of the transport fuel demand. I mean, the answer to that is this is precisely why we don't need syn fuels in road and we need direct electrification, because otherwise this is going to grow like tenfold, and we will never, and this has a huge environmental footprint anyway because of the materials requirements, because of all that sort of additional inefficiency. Yes, I'm happy to say this in Germany. Yes. So we do need e-fuels, but we need them in aviation and shipping. We don't need them in road, because otherwise it's going to be a power generation nightmare for the world, okay? And these are also other implications, geopolitical implications, it becomes huge, okay? So I think that is something that I would read in those terms. Last thing is we're talking about more expensive fuels, we're talking about measures that need to bring the cost down. I mean, technology learning theory shows that you actually get quite a lot of cost reductions at the beginning of the scale-up of alternatives. So we are talking about 0.05%. We are really at the beginning. So there is a lot that can be achieved by scaling up the early demand. And this is what I think the policy in Europe is trying to do. And by doing that, you can then kick off a whole kind of investment pipeline that then leads you to actually achieve quite a lot of cost reductions in the early phases of the deployment. And so that's precisely where we are in aviation. So I think there is a positive spin into what we are trying to achieve. We are trying to ride this kind of initial, or kick off this kind of initial significant reduction in costs of production, even though there are aspects related with feedstock costs in the case of SAF. But there is a big potential, I think, and that's what we need, I think we should worry about right now. Okay, the 2050 scenario with like this huge amount of electricity increase, I mean, I wish we end up having that problem and trying to sort it out. But before that, there's so much more that needs to be done to really bring down the costs. Otherwise, we'll never see that type of demand materializing. So the power sector is probably more concerned about whether or not this is a real scenario and what are we doing tomorrow to actually achieve that, because I have time to invest later, but first I want to see if we're actually serious about this kind of thing. So that's why I think the power sector presence, I've seen people from power sector talking about this stuff, but yeah, if I were working in the power sector, I would look at, okay, is this real? How real is it? What happens? Are we bringing down the costs? Are we not? Then I take investment decisions after that.
Pier Paolo, I think you gave part of the answer already, but just to go back to that really German discussion about the fact where do we use which kind of fuel, why do you think, I'm going to bring in the political argument that is used a lot, why cannot the market do this by itself? I mean, if you say it doesn't make sense to use these fuels in the aviation industry, the market will know that too. Yes, just because you got into that one,
okay,
so
fine.
Passionate.
I think the market will do that. E-fuels are expensive compared to direct electrification. I mean, just on that, I mean, you may want e-Porsche. Why they talk about e-Porsches and not e-Cinquecentos? Because you need to be wealthy to be able to buy e-fuels for your car, and actually wealthier than to buy an electric car, I believe. From a total cost of ownership perspective, electrification will win in the case of road transport, in my opinion. And that is going to be a limiting factor for e-fuels. This is precisely why I think the focus should be on stuff that, from a cost perspective, is really compelling, rather than stuff that, from a cost perspective, doesn't really deliver. Because if you try to go in that direction to extend the life of combustion engines, you are essentially providing an argument for false solutions, kicking the can down the road. You're not really trying to achieve, you're not serious, I think, about where you want to go. So, and in a way, the market will respond to that. But the end result will be that the more we try to divert the discussion into something that doesn't really work, the longer it's going to take to actually achieve the emission reductions. And this is where I have a problem. So yeah, the market argument is okay, technology neutrality is okay in principle, but in practice, we know that there are some technologies that have a much higher likelihood to deliver on costs and on emission reductions. And I think it's structurally important to make sure that our policy framework encourages accelerations in the development of those technologies. Otherwise, we're going to lose industry, basically. And I don't think anybody wants that.
So clear policy measures and just clear statements would be very important to speed up the process. I think we have time for one more question, if there's someone who really wants to get something off their mind. Yes, see someone in the back.
Thank you. I'm Carlos Ruiz from the International Renewable Energy Agency. More than a question, it's a comment. So from IRENA, we have a perspective looking at renewables and a lot of power sector. So we kind of get the more holistic view of not only aviation, but shipping and other hard to decarbonize sectors. And I think lately I've been seeing this trend of thinking that renewables will be the bottleneck, and can we achieve the level of renewables that we need? Will the grid be decarbonized at the same rate as shipping and aviation, etc.? And I think that's, at least personally, I don't think that will be the bottleneck. I think a much more critical issue is sourcing the carbon for these e-fuels. If it's not through direct air capture, if it's through industrial flue gases, then it's not really fully decarbonizing the fuel. And we also tend to talk about e-fuels and thinking they're completely synthetic, when in reality, some of these carbon molecules are from a biogenic source. So they're also coming from biomass. So I think biomass is key, and biofuels. And the other thing I wanted to say, because we were talking about the shipping sector, is that the shipping sector is actually moving really quickly. And they are very rapidly increasing their uptake of biofuels. I think recent policy developments sort of balance the scale in terms of cost with biofuels and at least marine diesel. So this transition is happening, and it's happening very quickly. I know, for example, in the port of Rotterdam, biofuel consumption doubled over the last year, and in Singapore, it increased tenfold. So this is happening at a very fast rate, which is, I think, good news for them, but maybe not so good news for shipping, for aviation, sorry.
It at least means that we really need, or aviation really needs to speed up the process. Hopefully, very shortly, I want to let you guys wish like 3 things, the 3 most important things. Mario already said 1, so you have 2 left. Let's start with Maximilian. What do we really need to speed up the process in the aviation sector?
It's hard to only find 3, but I would start with cross-value chain collaboration. We need more of that. So that's my first point. The second point, I think, is cross-sectoral collaboration and unlocking synergies there. I think if we're currently using CO2 from a salmon plant, for example, to produce e-fuels, because the CO2 from a salmon plant is way cheaper compared to CO2 captured from the air, we can drive this cost reduction down that we need at the beginning, even if it's not a long-term solution. So I would like to see more of that. And the third thing is, I think, let's show the world that we can create bankable projects for sustainable aviation fuels. We have these 100 announced plants right now. Roughly 10 of them have reached final investment decision. If we bring that number to 20, 30, 40, 50, I think we are slowly but steadily reaching a tipping point where we are in this S-curve of market adoption, finally getting into the exponential phase that we need.
Sounds good. Collaboration and money. What do you go for?
Okay, and my other 2 wishes would be, first of all, a clear regulatory framework that allows the operators, the industry to move into it with certainty. And coming from the point of view of startups and venture building and so forth, I see for a lot of these projects, the problem is getting funding, and the problem for the funders, for the investors, is to think, if I put my money into it, it will be actually considered tomorrow as sustainable, and will I get my investments back? So in order to unleash as much investment as possible to have a clear regulatory framework. And the other point is to scale up anyway, self-production as quickly as possible, because it can be burned by present generation airplanes with minimum modifications. So we have said that the airplane of the future is the airplane that's flying today, coming out of the production line, which is going to fly for the next 25, 30 years. So these planes are going to be crucial in order to decarbonize in the short, medium term. And the only way to do it is SAF.
I think the clear regulatory framework was also on your list, Pierpaolo.
I think we need pricing, regulatory certainty, so mandates, and we need a capacity to spend the money that are raised in that way in a very efficient and quick manner. We also need a very clear sustainability framework, like what define what is sustainable and what not. The more we go in that direction, the easier it will be to invest and mobilize, and get the transition going.
I agree with everything, and I'll just add very quickly transparency in how we communicate things to the public, and definitely international cooperation where the environment is put first.
Great, thank you very much. We'll work on the transparency, that's why I'm here. And I'll give back. Thank you very much for the discussion. It was very interesting to me, at least.
Please stay seated. Stay seated for a second. Thank you, Clara, so much for hosting this. Now, I didn't want to cut it short. Just the takeaways from this session alone, we could print a book. I mean, that's telling on aviation. Really, it was great. But I think you can clearly feel of the intensity of the discussion, including this horrible German e-fuels discussion, that this will hopefully be a productive day for all of this. So thank you all again very much. It was very insightful. And let's have at least a 10-minute break now, and then the next sessions will start. Thank you very much.